Hi guys, this is Haze here. I'm an artist and speed painter from Malaysia and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to talk about sketching and painting poses in Procreate, and let's get started right away. Now I have my reference picture on the left side of my multitasking panel, and I'm going to use it to refer while I sketch my pose. So when I sketch my pose, first I like to start with a gesture drawing which is very loose, and just to capture the movement and flow of the pose instead of worrying too much about the anatomy. Once I feel like I have the gesture right and it's showing the movement of the pose, I try to fit in the head onto the body by adjusting the proportions of it. Then I continue to build on top of my gesture drawing by introducing more lines to represent the limbs of the body. When I felt like I have expressed the gesture well, I will then move on to a thicker and darker stroke to put in all the anatomy details. So at this point in time, I'm using my knowledge of my anatomy studies in order to guide me on how to further sketch out the pose, but I am still following along my gesture drawing in order to have the same flow and movement and not worrying so much about the anatomy. I just want to get the flow right so that it looks like it's fluid. Using this method, you will require some knowledge about anatomy, but if you do not have, it is also fine because you're building on top of a flow, so it would still look a bit stylistic, so you do not have to worry about that. But of course, if you have knowledge about anatomy, it would be great and it would look a lot more accurate. So if you're unsure about how to draw or sketch certain parts of the body, you can always refer to the photo instead of worrying about the bones and the muscle structure. So right now I'm having problems sketching my face. In this process, I'm just going to shade the face first to get a sense of the light and shadow, and using this extra information I can then place down all my features on the face in order to get the proportions correct. So this is one method that you can use to discover proportions and the drawing if you're having difficulties like me. Once you feel like you have a good sketch, you can then flip your drawing to check the proportions and make any necessary adjustments. After that, I like to shade my entire drawing just to check the distance between the lines and see if they are correct, and to discover any problematic areas that I need to fix. So now I discover that I have some problems with the sole of my feet because it's just positioned wrongly and the toes does not look realistic at all. So I'm trying to observe and draw them correctly because I don't have a lot of anatomy knowledge about this particular area specifically. Using the same method of shading and trying to get the envelope shape correct, and then I slowly put in all the light and shadows in order to find the correct shape and proportions. I try to use this method to get the drawing correct for the feet. Once I feel like this layer of sketch is done and there's nothing else left to do, I can then lower the opacity of it and turn on the alpha mode. To do this, you just tap hold on the canvas and you click on alpha lock. Then I can change the color of it to be another color so that I can draw on top of it on a new layer. In this new layer, I'm using the same sketch brush but with a stronger color, and I'm taking my time in sketching all the details so that I can get everything correct and accurate. I also shaded some areas in order to check if the positioning and the scale is correct between lines. I'm also trying to do the lines clean. That means I'll be drawing them in one pass only and keeping them very neat. If I see anything wrong with the sketch, I quickly use the transform tool to select the area and move it down or up to rescale them or to make them proportionately correct. So I repeatedly use this process of sketching and cleaning up the edges, and then when I discover a mistake, I will use the free transform tool and move them accordingly to fix the drawing. So my advice is to try to use your knowledge of anatomy to fill in areas that you are very familiar with, and if there are areas that you are not familiar with, you can refer to the drawing and sketch by visual aid. When I'm happy, I create a new layer and I can then sketch in on my other elements. So the first thing I like to sketch and try and get the proportions correct is the terrarium cage around her. So I like to see which shape suits her the most, and after that I settle on this cube shape. So the process is really simple. I always start out by sketching them in blue first, and then after that I'll redo the entire sketch to a cleaner version using red. Then in another new layer, I started to sketch some elements of succulents that I found on Pinterest, and I sketched a couple of them, and once I've sketched them, I will then move them to the position that I want them to be. I try to get many different varieties of succulents for this purpose, and I tried like putting in geode crystals and other elements and see what works and what doesn't. But at the end of the day, everything that I want to be in the illustration are all in blue and stacked in different layers. When I'm done, my layers are a mess and the drawing is also a mess, so I try to organize the file a little bit. So first I group all the sketches of the flowers together into one group. To do this, I'm going to select the first layer by tapping on it, and then I'm just going to slide right for all the layers that I want to select. Then I'm going to hit the group button in order to group all these layers together, and I can then collapse them by clicking on the arrow. Now I can finally paint on the new layer using red to clean out all the lines of these flower sketches. So once again, I stroke them cleanly with one stroke each time using the sketch brush, and then I try to keep the lines as neat as possible. Then of course after that, if I have any overlapping lines, I will then erase them. And finally, I clean up the sketch of the body again with another new layer and another pass of lines because I feel that the previous one wasn't clean enough. So there's a tendency that if you keep sketching over your drawing again and again, your drawing will get stiffer and stiffer each time. So in order to prevent that, you will want to do the lines in one sweeping motion without doing any feathering or having very stiff movements in order to prevent having a stiff drawing. So keep your hands loose every time you sketch. So the next thing I want to do is to make a new layer underneath the girl's sketch layer. And then using the painting brush, I'm going to just paint down a mask for the envelope of the shape for the girl. Once I have a clean mask, I do the same for the flower sketch. I make a layer below it, and then I also put in the color for the shape of this mask. And after that, I realized that I need a background layer to reference from, so I set the background color to a light pastel pink, and then I also put in this reference that I found on Pinterest so that I can pick colors from it. Then I continue to create layers beneath the sketch layer and paint down all the masks for all the flowers. I'm not so worried about the color at this moment, I just need the mask to be there so that later when I paint, I don't go over the edges accidentally. But if you like, you can already start to coordinate your colors and drop in colors that you would like to use. So after that, I can try to define all the colors that I want for the girl by going into the mask for the girl and painting down all the colors that I like. So now that I have this mask, I can just turn on alpha lock, and then when I paint, I won't go over the edges that I've already have. So at this point, I take the time to slowly find the colors that I think will suit the visual based on the reference color scheme that I like. Once I have the colors that I like, I turn on all the layers including the frame, and I clean up the edges of the frame and see how I can fit the visual in and around it. So I erase parts of it that I don't need and see where I can put certain elements in front of it and what I can keep behind it. Once my visual is done, I will then come back to this layer and decide what color that I want to replace this with, but right now I'm not very concerned at the moment. At this moment in time, my sketch lines are all in maroon color and I've decided to change it. So I chose the sketch layer and I turn on alpha mode, and then I can paint over the layer with a new color. So I slowly start replacing colors for all the lines in this drawing. I'm just about to be done with changing all the colors for the sketch lines, and now I can then take a look at my layers and pick some of the base masks, and then I can then paint within these masks and layers to create all my gradients and coloring. So following the style of this visual concept, I am picking different colors that are the same tonal value. Even though they are different colors, they seem like they are blending without much visual change because they are of the same value, and then after that I will continue shading on top. So now I'm going to show you how I pick the colors for the gradient, which I say that they will be the same tonal value. So if you look here, I have my color picker and I'm searching for the color to match with the pink, and the purple that I choose is actually the same tonal value here. You can see it on top side by side as you choose your color. So if you choose the colors that are same value, when you squint your eyes they will disappear or vibrate, then you will know that you have chosen colors of the same value. So by using these colors in this manner, you will be able to change the color but not change any contrast at all, and it will give a slightly different effect when you paint. So after that, I just like to put on some highlights by picking a lighter color, and this will actually just finish off the visual nicely. Using this same technique, I put on gradients for the other elements and I start to shade them up by putting shadows and highlights after that. Because my lines are also very light, so the values of the lines and the coloring are very similar, I turned the lines to be a bit darker so that it gives a little bit more contrast when seen from far. And after that, I proceed to shade and color all my flowers. So you can just take a look here. I'm just gonna let this process play out, and we will continue the tutorial again once the flowers have all been shaded. Or you can just fast forward to 14 minutes. So we're done with the flowers, and now we can begin shading the girl. And I'm using the girl's mask layer, and I selected the skin already using the automatic selection tool. So the brush that I'm using here is the airbrush tool, and I like to put all the soft gradients in before I use the sketch brush to put in all the hard edges. Once my gradients are down, I use the sketch brush and slowly draw in all the hard edges, as you can see here. So this is a very simple two-step approach. Just use the gradients first and then after that clean up with sketch brush. And then of course, for more control, you can always use the smudge tool to smudge the tones around. So this time I'm not going for a very realistic look. This is a more stylized approach, closer to an illustration more than a painting. So I put in all the details like the tattoos, and if you see here, my face is already painted, but rest assured, because I will be replacing this painting with another one because I felt that this one wasn't good enough. So after this, you will get to see how I do the face. So all I'm doing now is putting in all the highlights for the skin and also cleaning up the nails before I move on to the pants. So for the pants, I use the same approach. I first use the airbrush to put in all the gradients, and then after that I will use the sketch brush to put in all the hard edges and the details. Here I've used the sketch brush to sketch down a lot of lines horizontally and vertically to simulate the texture of the jeans. For the top, I wanted to keep things very simple and airy and light, so I just put in a little bit of highlights and I call it done. So now that almost all the elements are done, I zoom out and take a look, and it seems like the flowers are a bit off. There's too much values changes going on, so I'm trying to edit down the visual a little bit to remove details so that I can keep things even more simpler. So after editing down and removing layers that I feel are redundant and too much, I feel that the visual is partially complete right now, and I can move on to finalizing the sketch lines. So I decided to change the borders of the sketch around the girl to be darker so that it stands out a bit more, but I'm leaving the lines that are inside to be the same color as before. Then I add some motifs for the hair and put some patterns in there. For the terrarium cage, I wanted to have it a little bit more sketchy, so I used the current one as a base and I started to do lines that are disconnected to give a more loose look. Then I changed the entire thing to white and I started to erase the lines so that it appeared to be behind some of the elements in the visual. After that, I assessed the entire illustration because it was now complete, and I started to look for mistakes and flaws and ways that I can improve this illustration. Then I started to think that what if I have water inside this terrarium, maybe it'll be cool, but I didn't know if it will look good or not, so I decided to try it out. So first I painted a mask as usual, and then I was trying to find a water level to see what I can do with it. So having a gradient with the same value really helps because it gels everything together nicely. I also used the selection tool to quickly mask out the lines for the water level and changing the color a little bit just to show separation. So I have my water now, and I have to worry about how I'm going to introduce this new element into the existing illustration without disturbing or disrupting the harmony of the elements that are working well together right now. So right now I have two layers. One of the water is below everything else and another layer is above everything else. So both have in different opacity. So now I'm trying to erase the top layer one to have some blank areas to let the elements show through. And then to take this experiment further, I started to draw bubbles and ripples on the water and certain lines to bring everything together. When I'm done, I decided to keep the water, and now I'm trying to do some sketches in the background to give it a little more interest as compared to just a blank background. So I'm just doing the sketches for now, and later on I'll figure out what to do with it. Once I'm done, I can move this layer around and recolor it to a color that I like. So here I'm finally painting the face because the one that I did previously before wasn't good enough, so I left that part out of the tutorial. So here I am sketching and shading the face with just the sketch brush. So here I'm also using the smudge tool, the flat brush smudge, to smudge them into the direction that I want and also to smooth things out. Because the style of shading that I'm doing right now is very close to pencil sketching and cross hatching, so I like to leave a little bit of textures here, But also when I'm doing this style, I am careful about the directions where I am sketching so that they appear as if they are flowing with motion. But anytime I see textures that I do not like, I use the smudge tool to get rid of them and to smooth things out. So take a look here at how I am doing the sketching and look at the directions of my brush strokes. Also notice that the brush marks, they are not overly harsh when I'm starting a line or when I'm ending them. And then when I'm smudging, I'm also going in the same direction in order to get the same flow of movement. After I'm done smudging, I can then add more lines on top of it to create a more darker look, which I will then smudge them out again, and this is a process that I will repeat until I am satisfied with the result. And here I'm changing the color of the lines to be a darker color because the initial brown was a bit too light for my liking and I couldn't see the contrast in the shading that I was doing. So as I'm sketching, I'm taking advantage of the directions of my brush stroke to keep things fluid and loose so that they don't look overly smooth. So once things are too smooth and defined, they start to look stiff. So as I'm shading, I also make sure that I have some shapes that is very clearly defined. Like if you look at the nose, there are diamond shapes and triangle shapes. So within these shapes are different tones that doesn't change much. So these are shapes that you can use to keep things simple and also to keep things stylized in an illustration. So this method of sketching is very similar to using pencil on paper, so you might be a lot more comfortable doing this, and once you have the result that you want, you can then proceed to color it. All you have to do is to sketch and smudge as you go, so make sure that you use the smudge brush and also to use the sketch brush when you're doing this. So once I'm done sketching, I then create a new layer beneath it and I put the color for the skin, and then I merge the layers and made it into grey using the saturation tool. So now I have one layer with the grayscale and the lines merged together and it's in grey, and I use the saturation brush to paint the colors over this layer. I can then change the colors for the face without affecting the values, and I just pick pinks for the blusher and the lips, and then I just work my colors in gradually. I'll be going into a lot more detail about this in the next tutorial that is coming up soon. But for now, I'm just using black to do the lines and give a lot more contrast to the eyes. And for this face, I'm just using black for the eyes only, just to have maximum contrast in this area, and I'm leaving the rest of the lines as it is. And I realized that my shadow areas are not dark enough, so I'm using the burn brush to darken the areas. Then I'm just using the sketch brush to put down some highlights. I'm not using any of my highlights and glitter brushes in this tutorial because this is a very different style from the usual ones that I usually do. And once the highlight is done, I can finally say that my work is over, and now I've completed this illustration. It's a bit whimsical, but I like all the succulents and all the details that make it pop, and most of all, I'm very happy with the face right now. So thank you so much for watching, guys, and I hope I'll see you next time for the next tutorial. Bye!